I'm Arnold Nader, and welcome to The Heat. I'm joining you via Zoom from my home just outside Washington, D.C. With COVID-19 changing the way we broadcast, this is part of our new reality. After weeks of protests across the United States against racial injustice and police brutality, the focus is now on police reform. Democrats and Republicans proposing legislation tackling discrimination and police misconduct. There is much to talk about. Joining us now from Baltimore is Jason Nichols. He is a lecturer in African American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Also joining us from New York is Rosa Clemente. She is an organizer, political commentator, and independent journalist. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Rosa, let me start with you. As I said, there are now efforts in the United States Congress to address the question of police brutality and police abuse. There is legislation introduced by the House of Representatives, and there is also legislation introduced by the U.S. Senate, where the Republicans have a majority. They address things like tracking police behavior, training issues, but they don't really address the core issue, which is accountability, which is enshrined in that clause known as qualified immunity, which many people feel gives police the right to do whatever they want to behave the way they want to. What do you make of these proposals in the U.S. Congress?
Well, yeah, and obviously the Republicans think there's nothing called systemic racism. So I'm sure that the bill will be stopped once it reaches the Senate. And reading through the proposals, you know, they say things like banning chokeholds. Chokeholds are banned in 11 major cities. They've been banned in LA and New York for over 20 years. Eric Garner, again, reiterated that chokeholds are banned, but police still use them. And, you know, I think people have to be aware there's also a lot of money they want to give to police, police associations right now so that they can use this money to have better relationships with the community. So although the Democrats finally came out of their bunker, 2 weeks they've been missing, and proposed a lot of this, the one I would see done immediately is the national database. So one police officer can't go to another department in the next locality and still have a job. But they really have to heed the call of what the people, especially young people, are saying. The system as we know it now of policing it's corrupt, is destructive, and can never be reformed. And then how we look at municipalities and support local municipalities in defunding the police and giving them money for and switching those monies to other programs. But let's, you know, the NYPD is the largest 7 cop force. If it was a military, it'd be the largest 5th military in the world. So we really have to think about what that means in light to, because most of these incidences are happening in places where there are Democrats in office and where there are a lot of already African-American and Latino police officers. They call for hiring more police officers of color. You go anywhere in New York City, most officers are of color, and they continue on with racial harassment, police harassment and violence.
That's right. In many of the cities where we've seen police brutality and police violence, the cities are controlled by Democrat politicians. Jason, what are your thoughts on these measures that have been announced in the United States Congress?
Well, I think Rosa pretty much recited what I would say almost in full. I think that these are small measures. You know, the banning of chokeholds is something that has already been done. You know, we've seen a lot of these small measures, whether it's body cameras, you know, citizen review boards, those things that have been done and have not produced the results that we need. You know, I'm somebody who believes in community policing. So, you know, in some cases, that requires more police. I will say that. You know, instead of being in a cruiser, actually going out and engaging the community, building those kinds of relationships. But I also understand the call to defund the police, because any police officer, any honest police officer will tell you that you cannot police your way out of a social problem. And police should be a last resort. And in many ways, we're overburdening police because we have no one else to call. So there oftentimes we have situations where people are having a mental health crisis and we call the police, and the police who are trained in a completely different way, and many of them, some of them don't even have a college education or know anything about how to deal with those kinds of situations are being thrust into a situation that they're not prepared for, and that can have deadly consequences. So we do need to address the root causes of crime. For the people who oppose defunding the police, many of them are saying, well, the root cause, we need police because crime is going to run rampant. And my thing is, if you address things like homelessness, the housing issues that we have, you address poverty, you address, even healthcare, you address those issues, crime will drop, and instead of just waiting for, calamities to occur, we address it at the root. We can actually make things happen. And, Rosa mentioned LA, they are, I think Eric Garcetti said he's going to defund the police by $150 million. And they're still going to represent more than 50% of the budget for the city. So again, I think people have to understand defunding the police and what that actually means, and how it will benefit many other things that are underfunded so far. And we're looking for immediate causes or immediate fixes for some of the crime issues we have. By the way, crime has been dropping, precipitously since 1991. But we look for these quick fixes rather than institutional fixes that will actually change things long term.
Rosa, on that question of defunding the police, we've heard that slogan, defund the police. It's become a bit of a hashtag. It's also been exploited by those who say that, look, if you defund the police, you're taking away protective measures from the police. You're leaving them more vulnerable out on the streets. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, let's look at the numbers of police that are killed every year in this country. It's like less than 1%, and those police are not just killed by other people. What it really means is to reimagine how our community should and look like. And we've had many people in the last 40 years put forth amazing proposals around what does community policing look like? What does it mean to use measures of restorative justice as opposed to arresting kids in, the New York City subway who are jumping the turnstile because they don't have the money to get to school? But, unfortunately, what happened is when Rudy Giuliani was the mayor here of New York City, and then Charles Bratton, who then would become the chief of police in LA, again, they instituted the broken windows policies. And what that meant is that you arrest everybody pretty much for everything. Jumping turnstile, throwing a piece of paper on the city sidewalks. And what that began to create is a database of particularly young Black and brown people who were already in the system. In New York State, 84% of people who are incarcerated for non-violent felonies, right? So what it really comes down to is the police unions. So when the Minnesota police chief yesterday said, I will no longer negotiate with police unions, that has really struck fear in these police unions, who then have the ultimate power. Some police unions, if not all, are as powerful as the mayors that they report to. A good example of seeing where this has happened in terms of defunding the entire police department and building it back up is in Camden, New Jersey. And any of us who are on the East Coast and have people in Jersey, Camden, New Jersey was very high on crime. What they ended up doing was disbanding their police department, rebuilding it with community, and putting over 40% of their budget back into social service programs for young people. And their crime has dropped over 50% in the last year to 2 years.
We are seeing other gestures around the country. These are more symbolic gestures. We're seeing monuments that are linked to slavery, that are linked to colonialism. They're being pulled down. NASCAR, which is an organization that has its roots in the South and is largely a white fan base, it says it will ban the Confederate flag. And we also heard from the NFL, which has come out and said that, yes, there are race issues in the country. What do you make of those gestures?
Again, they're largely symbolic. I think the NFL is going to do things because 70% of their workforce, at least in terms of the people that people watch, are African American or are Black, of some Black descent. So I think that they're going to make those kinds of symbolic gestures. NASCAR is probably they're trying to I think one of the things they realize is the country is changing and that they're going to need a new fan base. So I think that, I think what Rosa was going to say was, about the interest, the money being involved here. I also don't think that they've been resistant, because this is the thing that frustrates me so much, Adnan, is like the fact that none of this is new. I mean, just 5 years ago, we were having this very same discussion, and all of these corporations were very resistant to any changes. And, they were, kissing up to, as Rosa stated, the police unions, and all of the other people who were doing nothing but stoking division and stroking the back of institutional racism. And now that, there's a louder voice, people are even louder about the fact that they want change. Now they're making these symbolic gestures. I think there's a whole lot more the NFL can do. I think there's a whole lot more NASCAR can do, rather than taking down a flag. And as far as the statues, those should have come down a long time ago. They should represent, any statue should be a monument to what we aspire to be, saying this is an example from our past of what we aspire to be in the future. And a Confederate monument absolutely makes no sense. I don't know any country in the world that would praise a traitorous force in their country that drew, the blood of 600,000 people and tried to keep part of their population enslaved. So,
all right. Rosa, let me get your view on that. And also the fact, Rosa, that the one person who's not on board with all these reforms and all these changes is the president, President Trump. He is going to be holding a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's the place where 300 Black people lost their lives on Juneteenth, which actually marks the date that marks the end of slavery. What do you think of that?
Yeah, Juneteenth marks the day that enslaved people in Texas found out they were free 2 years later after the Emancipation Proclamation. Right now, we're at a critical moment in our movements. Either we fall for the police propaganda, i.e. kneeling with us and marching with us, or we fall for the capitalistic propaganda. And our movements must do better at uplifting that we really have to dismantle capitalism, right? I want every Confederate statue gone. When people go to Germany, they do not allow the swastika to be used, and there's monuments to those that were killed by the Holocaust all over Germany as remembrance. Right. But on the capitalistic thing, look, right now, if you turn on Amazon to watch a show, it says Black Lives Matter. Meanwhile, Amazon has been firing Black and Latino people for organizing. Here you have all of a sudden Roger Goodell making this NFL speech, not one time say, we did Colin Kaepernick wrong. He deserves to be hired if he wants to be hired immediately. But I think what's happening is it's also a global response to just the failures of capitalism. And we're living in the time of COVID. There's almost 45 million people who are unemployed. So all the confluence of all of this, you're going to keep seeing movements on the streets, but we might end up seeing backlash from white supremacists who are following 45 cues to hurt us.
And that's where we are going to have to leave it. Rosa Clemente, Jesse Nichols, thanks to both of you for joining us. We are going to take a short break right now. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
This is a show for people who love exploring, discovering, and experiencing life stories. A diverse, rich, and beautiful land will introduce you to extraordinary people like this woman in Bolivia taking back their heritage and independence. A fantastic 14-year-old who created a bank to help kids, keeping them off the streets. Entrepreneurs who are making a real difference every day. America's Now, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. Health experts have issued a dire prediction. They say tens of thousands more people will get infected with COVID-19 and die in the months ahead. That grim prognosis comes as coronavirus cases in the United States surge past the 2 million mark. To talk more about the pandemic's impact, Dr. Robert Morris is an epidemiologist joining us from Seattle, Washington. And from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Dr. Devra Davis is an epidemiologist advising governments and policymakers. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Davis, let me start with you with that alarming news that we're hearing there. The head of Harvard University's Global Health Institute, Ashish Jha, says the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 could reach 200,000 by September of this year. That's effectively doubling the current casualty rate. Why would that happen? And does it tell us that current efforts to fight the virus are not working?
No, in fact, they have worked in some areas, but the problem is that people are assuming they can go back to the way things were. And the reality is we will never be able to go back to the way things were until we have some control over this virus. And right now we do not. There is some good news, however, on the front of treatment that we can talk about later. But the reason for that projection is that many states are opening up and people are just not understanding the importance of things like masks and the basic things that we all have to do. Hand washing whenever you come in from being outdoors to your home is important. And frankly, disinfecting your doorknob. These are basic things that we have to get accustomed to doing if we've been outside where we've had contact. And there's more and more understanding that the transmission can sometimes be airborne. So of course, when people are going to be crowding together, as they have been in this country for a variety of reasons recently, it's going to increase the spread of the disease. I think the failure of some to accept that we have to have a new normal is contributing to the problem greatly.
Dr. Morris, if we look at the United States, it remains among the worst hit countries in the world, 2 million confirmed cases and more than 112,000 deaths. Now we hear that 21 states in the United States are reporting an increase in infections. To what do you attribute that increase?
Well, I think as Dr. Davis said, there is a sense that somehow we can just go right back to the way things were and a growing impatience with the lockdowns that were happening all over the country. And I think what has happened is the flood of people just thinking we can go back to the bars, we can go back to the restaurants, we can have big parties. The most dangerous thing in this disease is a crowd. And those crowds are where these so-called super spreading events are happening. And a lot of the growth of cases in this pandemic have been related to the events where one person is infecting 10 or 20 or even 50 people. And that's the danger, plus the fact that it's possible to spread this disease when you have few, if any, symptoms. So it's not even easy to know who to avoid. It's not easy for people to know when they really need to quarantine themselves.
You talk about crowds, Dr. Morris, and of course, in the midst of this pandemic, we had still have those massive demonstrations around the country, protests against police brutality, police abuse. Could that have contributed in some way to the increase we've seen?
Well, we won't really know about that for a few weeks to come. The thing that concerns me is we already had increasing cases as a result of people going back to normal. And on top of that, we had Memorial Day right before these protests began. So the concern I have is you have a situation where there were a lot of cases out there that had not gotten to the point where people even knew they were sick, and they were in crowds. And add to that tear gas, which is a horrible respiratory irritant that makes people cough and makes people try to breathe deeply. And you have a situation that concerns me deeply.
And I heartily agree with that. And let me add that what we're dealing with here is that it's almost as though we're in a science fiction movie, and people think that they can get out of the movie and now go back to something else. That's not going to happen.
But Dr. Davis, is there a problem with communication here in the United States when we look at this recent surge? Is the message not getting through to people? I mean, we also have problems with communication from the World Health Organization. They've retracted claims that asymptomatic transmission of the virus is extremely rare. And there was also confusion over whether people should or should not use masks.
Yes, I think there has been a tremendous amount of confusion, and I think that all of the different public health authorities bear some responsibility for this. But frankly, it's a problem in China. It's a problem all over the world. If you look at the countries where they succeeded best, Iceland is an example. The New Yorker had a very interesting article about what went right in Iceland. And what went right in Iceland, where they had the same surge that we saw in the United States, was they had a completely independent health professional and investigative team that went in as soon as they found a case, traced all of the contacts, and quarantined them. And they did that in a very rigorous, systematic way. And they now have an extremely low rate in Iceland because they did very aggressive policies. Of course, it's a very small country,
right,
but they were able to achieve control precisely because they followed clearly the directions of the public health authorities. We don't have that in the United States. We don't have a national recommendation even about masks. We don't have even uniform recommendations about school, about children. And as a consequence, there's all of these different policies, and I'm afraid the chickens are coming home to roost.
Dr. Morris, the top infectious disease expert here in the United States, Dr. Anthony Fauci, we've seen a lot of him on television. He has called the pandemic his, quote, worst nightmare, and he's warned that it's far from over, with all states now in the US in some stage of reopening. Where do you see this going?
Well, I think we're going to be struggling with this disease for at least another year, because we don't, until we have a vaccine, we don't really have a good way of treating it. Our only defense against it is to try to limit the number of cases until we're in a situation where people can get immunity from a vaccine rather than trying to get immunity from getting infected. And so that's the nightmare. The nightmare is there's no way out. As Dr. Davis said, we can't get out of this movie. This is really happening. And the notion that normal will not exist as we knew it until we have control over this disease, and that's going to take a vaccine. And the fastest vaccine historically took 5 years to develop from the first concern about the disease.
I've seen some reports that the virulence of the virus is attenuating, that it's getting less nasty. I don't know, have you seen those as well, Dr. Morris?
Well, I mean, viruses tend to do that. It's just, I haven't seen anything convincing that demonstrates that in fact it is getting less aggressive. And that if we wait long enough, that might happen, but that's going to take a long time, I think.
Dr. Morris, very quickly, we've got less than a minute left. The Washington Post has a report which says that the number of hospitalizations in at least 9 states has increased since Memorial Day. What do we read into that?
Well, I think it goes back to that whole question of reopening and an increase in exposures, which means an increase in cases. We really didn't have the pandemic under control when we started to reopen. We didn't have adequate testing for the kind of aggressive test and trace routine that Dr. Davis was talking about. And we don't have a buy-in to the whole notion that people really need to be wearing masks in public. And the fact that people still aren't and still resist it is quite astounding.
Yeah, we at Environmental Health Trust have information about some of the basic simple things people need to do. It's not the lack of information, it's the lack of a unified presentation of what needs to be done. That is the problem. And you know, when was the last time we saw Dr. Fauci on television?
Yep.
That's a problem in and of itself.
And that's where we have to leave it. Dr. Devra Davis, Dr. Robert Morris, thanks to both of you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. You can find us on Twitter at CGTN America and on Facebook at facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for watching.